Welcome to Web Development Lesson 2.3. In this lesson, we're going to cover the last of the basic CSS selectors, which is an ID selector that has an HTML component and its corresponding styling component. We're going to conclude the video with a discussion of what happens when CSS rules conflict. That's called CSS specificity. So let's get to it. So we have here a very basic web page with just 4 paragraphs, and I'm going to run it. You'll see that there's no styling. So let's do a little review of all the types of CSS selectors we have. And the first one is an element selector. So let's select all the paragraphs by writing P, and let's simply change their color. Let's run it, and we see that all the paragraphs become green. We notice that the next 3 or the last 3 paragraphs have a class attribute of my font, which will allow us to target these paragraphs separately. So let's change that. So for a class selector, we will put a period first and then the class name, which is my font. And in this case, let's simply change the font family of the paragraphs. And let's run it, and we'll see that the last 3 paragraphs receive the new font, while the first paragraph still stays with the Times New Roman. But let's say we wanted to do something special with this last paragraph. So we're going to introduce what's called an ID. An ID lets us select a specific element. Think of an ID the same way you do your own personal ID. Either from school, from library, if you have a driver's permit, you have a unique identifier that identifies you in the system, and no 2 people can have the same ID. Well, same thing happens in web development. Two elements cannot have the same ID. Again, it kind of defeats the purpose of what an ID is. If you want to target multiple elements, well, that's the purpose of the class selector. But if you want to target one element, well, that's when you do an ID. So let's give this an ID of fancy. And now let's target that one element that we gave an ID of fancy. Now, an ID selector works by first writing the hashtag and then the name of the ID. So it's similar in structure to the class selector, except that instead of doing a period, you do the hashtag. And also the fact that a class selector will select multiple elements, whereas an element selector will only select one element. And for this, let's change around the style to italic. And let's run it. So we'll see here that this particular paragraph received the italic, but it also still receives the class CSS rule and also the element CSS rule. You could kind of say that this last element belongs to the paragraph, the class, and the ID, which means that it will receive all 3 CSS rules. Now, using that same analogy, if you look at the middle 2 paragraphs, well, they'll receive the paragraph, the element selector CSS rule, as well as the class CSS rule, because that's what's part of them. Whereas the first one only receives the element selector. So let's practice this with the first paragraph. Maybe we can make, let's give it an ID of large, so we can target that particular paragraph. And let's practice that again. So the first paragraph has an ID of large. So if we want to target it, we're going to write large. And let's simply change the font size. Let's say 24. That should be big enough to show a difference. Okay, so we have all sorts of CSS rules happening on our web page. So let's review again. The first paragraph receives the green because it's a paragraph, the element selector. But then the size of the font also changes because we gave it an ID of large. And for that ID selector, we changed the size of the fonts. And then for everything else, still exists. The fact that this is green because of the paragraph, arrow because of the CSS selector. Same thing for this one. In this one, it's green because of the paragraph, arrow because of the class selector, and then italic because of the ID selector. So this one has 3 CSS rules being applied to it. And that's pretty much it. These are your 3 basic element CSS selectors, which are element, class, and ID. So the next thing I want to cover, and I'm going to erase a bunch of these selectors, is what happens when you have CSS rules that conflict. So right now, if I run it again, we'll see we're kind of back to our normal, which is all the paragraphs are green, because all the paragraphs are paragraphs. But what happens now if I do color equals red? So there's a conflict here. There's a conflict with the last 3 paragraphs in that the paragraph element selector will change them green, and then the class selector wants to change them red. So let's see what happens. So what you'll notice is that the paragraphs become red. This is part of a concept called CSS specificity. Kind of think of it like order of operations in a math class. That first thing you do are parentheses, then exponents, then multiplication, division, and then finally addition, subtraction. There's a natural order to the operations. Things will happen in that way. Well, it's similar in web development when it comes to CSS rules. The fact that if you have 2 conflicting CSS rules, right now, and I'm going to write it here, class selectors are bigger than element selectors. So if you have a class selector, whatever CSS rule is being applied there will take precedence over the paragraph. So let's see what happens when we do an element selector now. And let's change this to, let's say, blue. So hopefully this is not going to give me a problem. You know what? I'll just comment it out. Do it like that. So this is going to affect the last paragraph. That is a paragraph. It has the class, my font, but it also has an ID of fancy. So let's see what color it changes to. So you'll notice it changes to a blue. So what this is showing us is that an ID selector has a higher order precedence than a class and an element. And we can kind of practice it with the last one too, which I believe was large. And let's change that one to, let's say, maybe, I don't know, let's say purple. So for this first paragraph, it only has the, well, it's a paragraph. It has the element selector and it has the ID selector. So you'll see that, again, the ID selector has a higher order precedence than the element selector, so the paragraph turned purple. When you start dealing with CSS frameworks or web design frameworks, such as possibly Bootstrap, this is going to be key because those types of frameworks bring in a lot of styling, a lot of CSS, and you're going to want to try to manage this. So you're going to need to understand why certain things will change and other things won't. You'll need to do things to circumvent those frameworks if you want to personalize some of the styling that's happening on the page. And this understanding of CSS specificity will be key to you being able to target the elements the way you want to. Now the last one I want to discuss is what happens when you have conflicting CSS rules in the same category. And I'm going to focus right now on the class. So let's add another class to these. Well, let's add another class to this one. And let's say, I don't know. Wow, writer's block. Let's just say black then. So this particular element has a class of my font and a class of black. So let's go here and let's target that. So we have two conflicting class selectors that are being applied to this second paragraph. So the question is now, which one takes precedence? They're both class selectors. So let's run it. So we'll see that it turned black. So some people might suggest, well, maybe it's the order that we put the classes here. So let's try it out. Let's put the black class name first and then the my font. Let's see if it changes anything. Okay, so it doesn't. So the order in which the classes are listed on the HTML side does not affect the order of precedence. But this idea of order is part of the answer. If I write my black class selector first, then the my font comes afterwards. And look at what happens. Oops. Oh, that's because I still have it here. I did a copy. I was like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen. All right, so what I wanted to demonstrate is that the order in which the class selector CSS rules are being applied affects when you have conflicting CSS rules of the same type. So again, this particular paragraph, the second one, has both the black and the my font. The order here doesn't matter, but the order here does. So the my font comes after the black CSS selector, so this rule has a higher order precedence. But if I simply change the position, the physical position of that CSS rule in my file, now this one has a higher order precedence, and you'll see that this changes. Notice I haven't gone back to my HTML file. I'm not changing anything there. And there you go. So this is another tricky CSS specificity concept for you to try to master. But honestly, I think the easiest way is don't have conflicting rules. Really decide at what level your objects should have their color changed. So let's go back to our main slide. So we introduced ID selectors, which is the last of the basic selectors. And it's similar in the way it's used on the CSS side, in that you will specify a symbol, the hashtag, followed by the ID name of that particular element. Unlike a class selector, which is meant to target several HTML elements, an ID selector is meant to target just one HTML. That's the reason it's called an ID. Lastly, we concluded with an exploration as to what happens when you have CSS rules that conflict, and the importance of realizing when certain CSS rules will take higher precedence over another one. So again, it was a little complicated, but trust me, with practice, you'll get better at it. Enjoy.